Hello, and welcome to another exciting episode of I Didn't Know That, the show that may make you say, hey, I didn't know that. I'm your host, Chad Hale, Clinical Practices Supervisor for Pathways Community Mental Health. On today's show, we will be discussing service activity logs. A service activity log, or a SAL, provides vital information for identifying whether or not a documented activity was a direct service or an indirect activity. This in turn impacts on our billing and reporting of delivered services. It's an extremely important part of documentation with a high need for accuracy. It also is an area of documentation in which there's a high error rate amongst many of our staff, hence the need for this video. It's my hope that today we'll be able to clarify some simple rules that will help you to be able to consistently make the correct selections for both direct services and indirect services. Now you might be wondering, what makes up the SAL? Well, I'm glad you asked that. The SAL shows up in most of our clinical documents within Elmer. It includes your name as the provider, the name of the person who received the service, or the activity happens to be centered around in the case of an indirect activity, the date, the start and end time that the service actually happened, consumer attendance, contact type, place of contact, and lastly, it includes the CPT code for the service that was provided, or in the case of an indirect activity, the CPT code that the indirect activity is connected to. But that's a topic for another episode. Elmer automatically provides your name and the name of the person receiving the service, so that leaves you to correctly enter the rest of the information. The date and start-end time is pretty easy. It's always an accurate reflection of when the contact occurred. The date is the actual date, and the start time and end time are the actual times that the service or activity happened. This may seem like a no-brainer, but it isn't always for some, which is why I'm including details in this video. An example of incorrectly entering this information has sometimes happened when documenting from the Elmer calendar. We've had staff who document their contacts based on the planned appointment instead of the actual time that it started and the actual time that it ended. Failing to document the correct time could be considered Medicaid waste, and in the case of documenting a service as having been longer than it actually was, it could be considered Medicaid fraud. So it's pretty important that we do this correctly. Always identify the correct date, start and end time for what you've done. Prior to moving to the next step of information that you enter, you have to be able to answer this question: did I provide a service? Focusing on the answer to that question can guarantee that you will correctly complete the sections within the consumer attendance and contact type specifically. And these are the two areas that people make the highest degree of error. So let's take it one step at a time. Let's start with yes, I provided a service. And hopefully you correctly know the specific service that you provided, but that is also a topic for another time. If you provided a service, then there are only two possible correct selections within consumer attendance: client present or family present without beneficiary. In addition to that, client present is the only correct selection for the vast majority of the services that we provide. Family present without beneficiary is limited to only a few services, such as family training, if the recipient is not present, and family therapy without consumer present. Those are just examples, not necessarily all the services that this is connected to. But the shorthand is that most of the time, client present is the selection that indicates that you provided a service. That's it. If you provided a service, then no other options that show up in consumer attendance are valid selections. The next section of the SAL is contact type. If you provided a service, then face-to-face is the only correct option. No other selection should ever be chosen. If you provided a service, you select face-to-face. That's it. For what you select when you've provided a service, you choose client present or family present without beneficiary, depending on the service you provided, and face-to-face. No other combinations should ever be selected. Now, what about when you're documenting an indirect activity? To start out with, if it was indirect, then none of the selections that we just discussed that indicate you're having provided a service are to ever be selected. If the activity is not a service, hence it being indirect, then you do not select client present. You do not select family present without beneficiary. You do not select face-to-face. All three of those are always incorrect options for indirect activities. So pull them off the table if the answer to your question, to the question, did you provide a service, is no. Under consumer attendance, the options for documenting an indirect activity are client cancellation, no-show, staff cancellation, and staff only. That's it. Those are the only ones. If your documenting is not related to a cancellation or a no-show of an appointment, then the correct option is always going to be staff only. Now, this is an area of common confusion for staff because you might say, Chad, but it wasn't only me. There were other people there. Yeah, I understand that. But client present does not mean, hey, there was a person here. Client present means I provided a direct service. That's what that selection is indicating. The selections of the SAL are following the rules associated with billing. Because it is related to accounting, it's black and white. There's no gray here. You either provided a service, which means you select client present or family present without beneficiary, depending on the service, or you did not provide a service, which means you do not select those. You have to select one of the other options. And when it's not related to the cancellation or no-show of an appointment, that means it's staff only. When choosing the correct selection for contact type, when you are documenting an indirect activity, you never choose face-to-face. Just like I just discussed, face-to-face does not mean in the presence of another human being. Face-to-face means I provided a direct service. If you did not provide a direct service, then you do not select face-to-face. Instead, you select consultation support, not face-to-face, or telephone. Those are your only options for an indirect activity. One thing to be aware of is that consultation support and not face-to-face mean exactly the same thing. They both mean indirect activity. Truth be told, when Elmer launched, there was no consultation support option. There was only not face-to-face. But what we found was that clinical staff really struggled with selecting not face-to-face if there was another person present. So we added the option of consultation support in order to give them something to select that would seemingly make sense to them. It does, however, mean exactly the same thing as not face-to-face. It means an indirect activity occurred. Another area that is part of the SAL is the place of contact. Now, under normal circumstances, that's not typically an area of concern. It's usually going to be home, office, or community, something like that. But I'm recording this during COVID-19 pandemic, and that's resulted in some changes in how place of contact interfaces with the other options. For the sake of simplicity and time, my goal with these videos is to keep them short. I'm not going to go into detail on all of that in this video because I wanted to comment or wanted to focus this on common SAL issues so that it isn't just specific to COVID-19. I will go into greater detail in regards to the issues created by the COVID-19 billing rules in another video. In the meantime, if this is during the pandemic and we're still under the changed rules, and you have any questions about correct selection for contact type or how it impacts on any of the other areas of the SAL, please reach out to me. I would be happy to go over it with you and help you figure out how to correctly code things. The last part of the SAL is the CPT code of the service that you provided or using that CPT code when documenting an indirect activity. This is another area that I'm not going to go into detail today due to time, but will be covered in greater detail in another video. I will say in closing that if you are using IND 25 in any kind of regular fashion to sign documents, then you are most likely using it incorrectly. IND 25 gets used incorrectly a fair amount. We're trying to fix that. So if you are a heavy user or are using it semi-often, please get in contact with me so we can talk about how you're using it, because it's most likely incorrect. And I'm here to try to help you with knowing how to do it correctly. So I want to support you in that. So thank you for your attention. If you have any questions about this topic or would like to learn more, please contact me and I'll be happy to help you with that. In the meantime, I encourage you to be curious and ask the hows and whys of what we do so that you may know more. After all, knowing is half the battle. Until next time.